Okay, so yeah, it's a small world. So here we are together in the living room of the small world. uh, so I'm curious what would be useful for me to speak to, or what's been coming up for you guys? What's been the topics of discussion for the 3 days?
Yeah, does anybody have anything that's on their mind that they want to hear about?
I mean, the thing I just said about teacherly, right? Like we all have some triggered words, and this is trigger. And Matt and I were having a conversation about teacherly, and so maybe you can share a little bit about that. But I'd love for you to explain that concept and why is it important that we have some teacherly authority?
Yeah, start there.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah, it's funny because I end up using words like education and teacherly in a way that's much broader than is typically thought about. And so what I usually start the conversation about teacherly authority with the work of a comparative psychologist, Michael Tomasello. So comparative psychology, it's a field that looks at how human minds are different from animal minds, or the same as animal minds. It compares animals and humans. And so there's always been this question, especially with primates, what's the difference between us and primates, right? And there's many people have looked at that many ways. And over the years, it's been like, not much. Like that's been the resounding refrain. Like there's not as much difference as you think. But Tomasello was convinced, as we all are, that, but obviously there's a huge difference. And so he's trying to narrow in on what is that difference. And it ends up being that humans undertake a certain form of intergenerational transmission, a certain form of complex culture, and then the passing on of that complex culture, which animals simply don't do. And they don't do because there's a basic thing that he calls the joint attentional situation, which you do not find in nature the way you find it in humans. The joint attentional situation is when you and I are orienting around something, and we both know that we're orienting around that thing. Right. So like in nature, spontaneously, monkeys don't point, and monkeys don't follow points. So if you point like at something, even very small, if you point and look at something, even very small babies will go to your point and go to your look. Dogs will do that because they've co-evolved with us for hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years. But in nature, like Jane Goodall style, you're like embedded with the monkeys, you will find no spontaneous pointing and following of pointings. And although there are certain things that get passed on, it is not through the relationship of a joint intentional situation where there's, what I'm now bringing the word, where there's a relationship of difference in knowledge and capacity. And the difference in knowledge and capacity is recognized by both parties. So that is a uniquely human, it's what Tomasello calls a species-specific trait. And one way to think about it is that because of the vulnerability of the human baby, that the human baby is so vulnerable, takes so long to become self-sufficient. Like the gazelle comes out of its mom and it's walking around immediately. It's running in like 2 or 3 hours. And it basically can do everything the other gazelles can do. It can't have babies yet. That'll take a little time, but it can eat the grass. It can poop. It can walk, and it can flee the dangerous thing. Like it's doing the gazelle stuff like in a couple of days, basically. Humans are just not like that. And neither are other advanced mammals. Stephen Jay Gould hypothesized that there's something about brain size and a few other factors that the more intelligent the species, the longer the duration of immaturity. And so the hypothesis here is that because of the length of the duration of immaturity of the human, this new emergent cultural phenomenon had to occur, which was this complex joint attentional situation where we're orienting together about the world and passing on knowledge. Now, of course, I haven't mentioned speech, and of course, speech emerges. Speech requires the joint attentional situation to get going. So there's a long, complex thing about how the hell did we even start speaking? Like that's some crazy crazy stuff, but that happened. So this is a long way around of saying that what I'm referring to as teacherly authority is basically something that humans have always done. And it's one of the things that actually kind of like makes us distinctly human. And it's the ability for us to orient around a relationship of what I call epistemic asymmetry or asymmetries of knowledge and capacity. We orient around it, right? The child knows that the parent knows more. The parent knows that the parent knows more. They're both interested in getting the kid to know as much as the parent, right? That's a situation of teacherly authority. It's an educational situation. And that's the primordial situation of education, the family or the tribe, right? The family or the group roughly less than 150 people. When you get that, then you start to get education with or without schools. Schools don't come till much later. This is my idiosyncratic definition of education. Some people might call this socialization or enculturation, or there's a couple other terms. But so that's how I think about it. I think about teacherly authority as being like a species-specific trait, that it's like a recurring archetypal social situation, which we feel when we fall into it. And because it has that dynamic, it can be preyed upon by other systems and relationships, right? So it's like the co-opting of teacherly authority by the state is one of the things that happened with modernity. The co-opting of teacherly authority by the church is one of the things that happened with pre-modernity. Right now, the co-opting of teacherly authority by technologists is one of the characterizations of post-modernity. So the question of how to maintain the integrity and sovereignty of relationships of teacherly authority, that's a very interesting question. And so I'm using teacherly and authority, and both of these are words that bother people. And so I get that. And I'm actually fine with using other words to describe that same set of concepts, which is this like deeply basic and primordial way of relating that humans need to figure out how to do, or else we forget how to pass on culture. We forget how to raise the younger children into a situation to take over full responsibility. I've been writing a lot lately about propaganda for obvious reasons. And one of the ways you know that it's propaganda as opposed to education is that you can't graduate from a propaganda campaign. There's no intention of bringing you up and into the state of knowledge and responsibility and power that the propagandists have, right? There's an unbridgeable asymmetry of knowledge, right? The educational relationship, there is an asymmetry of knowledge, and the whole point of the relationship is to bridge that, right? The whole point of the relationship is to graduate, where you actually know as much as me, maybe more than me, because you have to take over responsibility for this society, right? The propagandist has no intention of letting you take over responsibility for society. They're trying to control you, control your behavior through the use of information. The educator has all intents. They want you to become responsible, to step into your autonomy, to know as much as you know. You're looking over the shoulder of the educator at the same text. Anyway, so there's more to say about that, but so there was a question. Yeah.
Yeah, so the conversation that Mihai and I had around this question of teacherly authority wasn't necessarily the authority part. It was actually the term teacher, because in our culture, teacher is presumed to be a professional in an institution. When you just described that term, I think of parental or tribe authority. And so how do you just make a distinction between teacher and parent? And then also how do you insulate your communication so that people, when they hear teacher, they don't think of the professional in the front of a classroom?
Right, totally. I mean, a few things. Yeah, teacherly authority, parental authority, those are both types of some broader class. Now, I don't know what the broader class is. Like that there's teacherly authority we associate with teachers. There's parental authority we associate with like the nuclear family unit. And then there's this other thing you called like tribal authority, which is interesting too, which is like a distributed authority. In all of those cases, there's that asymmetry of knowledge and power. and both parties have knowledge of that, and both parties want to obsolete that, right? So that's the thing. What we call it, I'm not sure. I usually do what I'm doing here, which is start out by saying, hey, when I say education, I don't mean schooling. And when I say teacher, I mean the kind of teacher that could have existed in a tribe 200,000 years ago before there was ever, right? It's like I'm teaching you how to chip this stone to make it sharp, right? Watch me, kid. Chip the stone. No, not like that, like this. And then that sharing of joint attentional situation, using language to improve upon the shared cultural object. That's what Tomasello calls cultural ratcheting effect, where you get cultural evolution. So through the transmission of culture, you improve upon culture. So that's the other trick to get, which is that the good educator, again, unlike the propagandist, leaves open the top end so that the one being brought up and into a greater state of knowledge can work back upon the knowledge and improve it, and therefore evolve the culture. Whereas when you get breakdowns in teacherly authority, you end up getting the culture passed along without any opportunity for revision, or breakdowns in the possibility for intergenerational transmission, which is what we're having here in our society, I believe, which is an increasing generational gap that can't be bridged. And then there's an acute rift between generations. And then that's basically a recipe for civilizational collapse, unfortunately.
Wow.
Now, one of the things I think you've talked about, or maybe Rob, is that teacherly authority is contextual, right? So in this case, we're talking about your education topic, so you're the teacherly authority. But if we're here and we're talking about juggling, then all of a sudden Dan might be, and he was yesterday, the authority on juggling. So is that one part of it, and is that how it differs from propaganda?
That's a hugely important nuance there. And this is very true for being able to identify, well, what are the dysfunctional forms of teacherly authority? And there are some places when you hear teacher, it's like, oh, they're a spiritual teacher, and it's in those contexts where you get really disruptive forms of teacherly authority, where you have to do exactly what you just did there, say, well, wait a second, what are you actually an expert in here? What do you actually have asymmetry on with me on, right? That's where it exists. So like when I go to the mechanic, like I know nothing about cars. And so if he's trying to explain to me something about my car engine, I'm in his hands, right? And now I'm a psychologist, so I'm aware, and so I can actually do that flip. But many people who have expertise in some areas think they have expertise everywhere, and they basically will not let anyone have teacherly authority over them, even when they really should, right? And so that's important to get, that these are flexible, because these are hierarchical relationships, right? But they're flexibly hierarchical. So that means that in some contexts, kids are your teacher, right? This is important to get that. And this is where the dynamics of intergenerational transmission change over historical time. As the nature of the culture changes, sometimes it becomes more and more necessary to listen to the future that's emerging through what the children have to teach. And that's another conversation. So the flexibility of that hierarchy is very important to grasp, and good teachers do that really well. So there's a need to be able to listen into the context of relationship and listen into that and what is actually emerging here, right? Because sometimes there is an asymmetry, but it's not, there's no legitimate institutional context. And so you can't lock in the allowance. It's like, I do know more than you and I could help you, but there's not a safe context for us to be in this relationship of asymmetry, right? So that's important to get to. So there's institutionalized and non-institutionalized forms of teacherly authority. Institutionalized teacherly authority, you don't have to negotiate. It's just written into the rules. And that's why sometimes it's a problem, because the only reason you have teacherly authority is because the state says you're supposed to be teaching me. There isn't a demonstrated epistemic asymmetry, right? There's not a demonstrated difference of knowledge. In outside of institutional context, like when I go to the mechanic or something, or if I'm just at the store with somebody, or just meet somebody, and then it's this nuance of negotiation and kind of checking in and checking out of what's occurring here, right? And not all relationships are like somebody just having a conversation, but if something emerges where an asymmetry of knowledge emerges, the question is not just because I have an asymmetry, therefore I'm the teacher. No. You need the asymmetry plus the allowance by both parties for there to be the relationship, right? And this is another important thing to get. And another thing about propaganda, like the teacher wants to know you're ready, checking in with you to make sure you can hold what the learning like will be for you, right? Propaganda shoves it down your throat, even if you're not ready, even if you're being emotionally destabilized by the onset of the information, right? Teacher wouldn't do that, right? Because the relationship with teacher authority is also an ethical relationship. It's not just a relationship of knowledge, it's also a relationship of power. It's because it's a relationship of power, the ethics of it are very subtle and important to grasp. Yeah, so it's rich. So thank you. Yeah, so the multiple hierarchies